In South Africa, what we've had to do is, as Mark kind of spoke a little bit about yesterday, is we formally prioritized our work. And that wasn't an uncontested thing. In other words, the legal profession, or certain parts of it, felt that an agency like ours could not prioritize because we needed to treat every case that came through our doors, every complaint equally, and the act of prioritizing would be perceived on the one hand as victimizing certain certain markets or certain sectors, and on the other hand, ignoring legitimate complaints if we didn't prioritize those complaints. So it was seen as an unfairness point that we could not prioritize because, as a public agency, all complaints are equal, should be treated equally by us. And we had to kind of maneuver ourselves through an environment where this was lawyers in particular felt very strongly about this. And so we had to kind of demonstrate that the manner in which we went about prioritizing was fair and objective. In other words, this wasn't us deciding, well, we don't like cement companies and therefore we're going to hound them. We had to kind of come up with a logical way to convince people that this is a considered decision, this is a logical decision we're taking for good reasons. So what we did, do you want to,
I was just going to say, this is just a fact of life for enforcement, that whoever is picked on feels it is unfair that they've been picked on. Now, if I'm speeding and the cops stop me, I go through exactly the same process. First of all, I deny that I was speeding. Then, unfortunately, some evidence is produced that I was. So the second thing is I say, yeah, but, did you see all those other people speeding? You should get them, not me. Then the third thing in enforcement is they say, well, sorry, we've picked you. So you say, well, all right, but, my circumstances were special. I was in a hurry to get to the nearest bar or whatever, or hospital or something. In any case, I hope you just give me a warning. You're not going to take any legal action or impose a fine. And then if you say, yeah, it's going to be fine, then you want to minimise, well, it should be a low fine, And then finally, I don't want any publicity about it. So this is like human nature.
Right.
And you're quite right that you do get criticised for picking on people.
Right.
And so it's good to have a bit of a rationale.
Right.
But it's also just a fact of life for someone who's involved in enforcing the law, that the person on the receiving end always thinks it's unjust that they've been picked on.
Right. And these were, certainly in South Africa, the legal profession could have made legal argument before a court saying this big bad public agency is overreaching its powers and they're hounding us and it's unfair. And that's the kind of thing that would fly in a South African court given our constitution and the kind of rights that everybody's meant to have. So we've had to kind of justify this prioritization. And the way we've done it is we said, look, first we're going to set up a set of criteria by which we prioritize. And so we set up this set of criteria. And our criteria were, firstly, we said, look, what it makes sense is that higher prices as a consequence of anti-competitive behavior will affect poorer consumers more in the markets in which they predominantly, or they are the bigger players. So we said, in prioritizing, we're going to start off, we're going to think through what are the markets that will affect poorer people if there's anti-competitive behavior in it. The other criteria we put out is we said we want to tackle those markets that raise the costs of doing business. Because, if you raise the cost of doing business, you're going to cripple the economy. You're not going to get a dynamic economy. It's going to have ripple effects. It's going to prevent investment from happening. People are not going to want to come and operate in your market because certain costs are too high. What were those costs? There were primarily two that in applying that criterion, we came up with two markets primarily that we needed to tackle: telecoms and banking. Telecoms is the backbone of any business. If the costs are too high, businesses kind of bear the brunt of that. Bank charges in South Africa were particularly high, especially for the small business guy who counts all their pennies at the end of the month. When they looked at all their bank charges, this was an exorbitant amount, and we thought that was something we needed to tackle because it's raising the costs of doing business. Then the third criterion...
Shan, just perhaps before you continue, on the issue of cost of doing business, I'm just curious. I know cost of electricity is perhaps, compared to other African countries, relatively cheap in South Africa.
No, it's also high, but yes.
But how come electricity was not?
Well, how come electricity was not is because we have a sector-specific regulator, and it's a regulated price, and we deferred to them on that. This was like a difficult territory for us to go into. But certainly business was telling us, business in South Africa complains about regulated prices being too high. So that's point taken, right? So then the third criterion we came up with was the one that was mentioned. We were saying that we need to put our weight behind the South African development agenda. And at the time that we did this, and even now, the big development agenda in South Africa, and I would imagine it would be common to a lot of other African and developing countries, was infrastructure build. Okay, so everybody's building infrastructure. We were taking these decisions just prior to the World Cup, when stadiums were being built and our road network was being revamped, and we built the Gautrain, and there was a lot of infrastructure development happening. How can an agency like us contribute to this development agenda? Well, there were two things. One is, if input costs are high, if the cost of cement, if the cost of steel, you need steel to build bridges, if the cost of tar, bitumen, the thing you use to make roads with, if the cost of bricks, if all of these are high, then this is going to cost the government more to fulfill their development objectives. So let's just look at these markets and see where there are high costs, and if we can bring down these costs, we can contribute to the development agenda of the country. The fourth criterion related to the third was that as part of our government's industrial and economic policy, the biggest issue facing South Africa is job creation. Okay, so that's the big issue around our economic policy agenda, and what the economic policy agenda was attempting to do was to create more jobs, which means more businesses needed to be open. There was just a limited number of jobs. It wasn't that people were lazy, there were just no jobs for them to work in. So we needed to create more jobs, and in the economic analysis that was done, one of the reasons that there were not more jobs being created in South Africa is our manufacturing sector was not developing because the input costs into manufacturing was too high. Right? So the input costs into manufacturing is, your kind of plastics, the plastics that, so you produce, you have plastics and then you do other things. You make value-added products with plastics. or in terms of our resource industry, South Africa was mining stuff off the ground, sending it overseas, but not adding any value to it before it got exported. So we didn't have our own manufacturing sector because the inputs into manufacturing were too high, and we asked ourselves the question, how can we as a competition agency now bring those prices down in order to boost our manufacturing industry, which will then create more jobs.